Hi, my name is Chasta Musenda, and I want to thank you for listening to today's message. I hope this message challenges you to know Christ, experience community, and influence culture.
In a commencement address at the University of Vermont, playwright David Mamet described the death grip of fear. He talked about 4 American paratroopers who were too scared to jump into Normandy on June 5th, 1944, and how that fear surely haunted them for years to come. He described the excuses we give for not immersing ourselves into the mysteries of life, as he called it. But then he said these powerful words in his commencement address. We all die in the end, but there's no reason to die in the middle. How many of you know that sometimes we allow things to seep into our lives, whether it's fear or it's some kind of a worry or anxiety or whatever it may be, that wants to rob life from us. And so, yes, one day we will die, but how many of you know oftentimes we die before we die? We die in the middle. We allow things to come, we allow things to happen that cause us to die early because that something robs the life from us. God has called each one of us to follow Him. And God has called each one of us to live on mission. But to follow Him and to live on mission requires a life of obedience. But so often, we let barriers to obedience cause us to die in the middle. We let barriers show up in our life that robs from us the call to live a life of obedience. So as we continue our series, Old School Sunday School, we're actually today going to revisit a hero of the faith that we actually looked at last year as well. But today we're going to take another look at his life, and that is the life of Moses. As you follow the story of Moses, you actually discover 3 barriers to obedience that he encountered. 3 barriers that I really believe relate profoundly to us today. Here's the first barrier of obedience. The first one is personal excuses. Personal excuses. Anybody ever given an excuse a time or two in your life? Career Builder has published some of the most bizarre excuses that people have, bizarre excuses for why people are late to work. For why people are late to work. And these are some of their real life excuses. My deodorant was frozen to the windowsill. My car door fell off. I dreamt I was already at work. I had an early morning gig as a clown. My fake eyelashes were stuck together. And my personal favorite, although it has been 5 years, I forgot I did not work at my former employer's location and drove there on accident. Creative excuses. Moses came up with some pretty creative excuses of his own. He came up with some excuses whenever God shows up in a burning bush and calls Moses to return to Egypt to deliver the children of Israel out of Egyptian slavery. In fact, if you follow his story and if you follow that encounter at the burning bush, you discover that Moses had 5 excuses. 5 excuses. Here's his first excuse, and see if any of these resonate with you. And by resonate, I mean see if you can relate to any of these. The first excuse was insignificance. Insignificance. And the excuse was simply this: I'm not important enough. Exodus 3:11. This is how Moses responds to God. Who am I to appear before Pharaoh? Who am I to lead the people of Israel out of Egypt? In other words, Moses felt insignificant for the task. He basically told God, God, I'm a nobody. Why would you pick me? Here's the second excuse: incompetence. In other words, I don't know enough. I don't know enough. Exodus 3:13. Moses says this: if I go to the people of Israel and tell them, the God of your ancestors has sent me to you, they will ask me, what is his name? Then what should I tell them? In other words, Moses is saying, God, you don't understand. My competence doesn't cut it. I don't have what it takes for this assignment. Excuse number 3, invalid. I'm not credible enough. Exodus 4:1, Moses says, what if they won't believe me or listen to me? What if they say, the Lord never appeared to you? Now, why would Moses use this excuse? Because Moses had already tried once to deliver an Israelite from Egyptian slavery. And that didn't turn out so well. He ends up killing the Egyptian, and then he gets chased out of town. So in Moses' mind, he's got a credibility gap. He's saying, I'm not credible for this task. Here's the fourth excuse: inadequacy. Inadequacy. I'm not skilled enough. Exodus 4:10, Moses said, "O Lord, I'm not very good with words. I've never been, and I'm not now. Even though you have spoken to me, I get tongue-tied, and my words get tangled." Interpretation: God, I'm inadequate for this job. My skills don't measure up. And excuse number 5, inferior. I'm not good enough. At the end of all of his excuses, Moses says this: Lord, please send anyone else. In other words, I can picture Moses saying, God, if you'll line up 1,000 people in one long line, any one of them would be better than me. Any one of them would be a better pick for this assignment, God. So get the picture. Moses has 5 excuses: insignificance, incompetence, invalid, inadequacy, and inferior. In other words, God, I'm not important enough, I don't know enough, I'm not credible enough, I'm not skilled enough, I'm not good enough. Can anybody relate to at least one of those excuses? We've all felt them. But how many know that just because you feel the excuse doesn't mean the excuse deserves authority? You can feel it, but that doesn't give it the right to rob you. Because excuses, and I shared this with you last week, every excuse, if we're not careful, excuses will become the permanent exit ramp of obedience in our lives. You see, excuses are an attempt to acquire short-term relief, right? It's an attempt to acquire short-term relief from our fears, from our failures, from our discomforts. But the problem is, excuses always lead to the same place: regret. I mean, have you ever given an excuse for something and then later you said to yourself, that's the best thing I've ever done? No, you give an excuse and then later you start rehearsing in your mind why you shouldn't have done that, and then all of the excuses are amplified. Well, I really am inferior. I really am inadequate. I really am invalid. I really am incompetent. Like, we've got all the excuses we give, and then they multiply when we actually use them. So how does God respond to Moses' excuses? He has 3 responses. When you read Exodus 3 and Exodus 4, you discover that God's response to each one of Moses' excuses was this: Moses, I've sent you, I've equipped you, and I'm with you. Yeah, but God, you didn't understand. Like one time I tried this, Moses, I've sent you, I've equipped you, and I'm with you. You know, God, I really don't speak very well. Moses, I've sent you, I've equipped you, and I'm with you. Please, God, just send somebody else. No, Moses, I've sent you. I've equipped you. And Moses, I'm with you. Listen up. Whatever God has called you to do, this morning I believe he would say to you, I've sent you. I've equipped you. And I'm with you. Wherever God has called you to go, I believe he would say, I've sent you. I've equipped you. I'm with you. He's entrusted to you. He's deposited into you what you would need to do what he's called you to do and to go where he's called you to go. Don't let excuses like, well, I'm too young, or I'm too old, or I'm too weak, or I ain't got the bank account, or I don't have enough talent, or you fill in the blank with whatever the excuse. Don't let the excuse hold you back. I love something Hal Donaldson said. He said, achievement has no age limit. Isn't that good? Achievement has no age limit. And then he gives some examples. I love this. Mozart began composing at age 5. Anne Frank was 13 when she wrote her diary. Gymnast Nadia Comaneci was 14 when she got a perfect 10 in the Olympics. Leonardo da Vinci was 51 when he began painting the Mona Lisa. Dr. Seuss was 53 when The Cat in the Hat was published. J.R.R. Tolkien was 62 when The Lord of the Rings was published. Don't let your excuses become a barrier to your obedience. They are the exit ramp from the highway of obedience. Hear me and hear my heart in this. If you're not careful, you don't need the enemy to defeat you because you've already defeated yourself by your excuses. Here's a second barrier of obedience, and that is, number 2, is people's opinions. After trying a bag full of excuses, Moses finally heads to Egypt, and when he gets there, God, he tries on multiple attempts to convince Pharaoh to let the people of God go, to let them leave Egypt, to release them out of slavery. And time again, he's trying to convince them to do so. And time again, Pharaoh is saying, no, he's not going to do it. And so eventually, like God, like all these things happen, all these plagues hit the land, and until finally the firstborn dies. And that's whenever Pharaoh relents and he says, get out of here, right? So Moses leads the Israelites out of slavery through the Red Sea, and whenever he goes through the Red Sea, the sea closes in on the Egyptian army and they're killed. Can I just pause and say this? A few moments ago, you saw people being baptized. Do you realize that what happened with the parting of the Red Sea was actually symbolic of the baptism to come? Why? Because whenever the Israelites left Egypt, and they walked through the Red Sea. The waters had parted. They walked through the Red Sea. What were they leaving? They were leaving behind Egypt. What did Egypt represent? It represented slavery. It represented 400 years of bondage. And where were they going? They were going through the water to the other side to freedom. They were pursuing the promised land. And what happens to the army? The army chases them through the water. The water closes in. They all drown. Listen, when you are baptized in water, when you go under the water, you're saying, I'm done with the old way of life. I will not live in bondage or slavery any longer. And when you come up out of that water, you're making a declaration. I am free in the name of the Lord. It's not just getting wet. It's not just like some people look like, why would you even do that? It's symbolic of what Jesus has done in our life, that he has set us free. Yes. That's free. That wasn't even in the notes. They get on the other side of the sea, and it's time to take the land of Canaan. The land of Canaan was the promised land. It was the land God had promised to give to the Israelites. So what does Moses do? Whenever it comes time to take the promised land, he sends 12 spies into the promised land. And they're going in to scope it out to see, okay, what's the best way to take this land? They come back out of the promised land, these 12 spies, and when they return, this is what they say. Numbers chapter 13, verse 27. This was their report to Moses. We entered the land you sent us to explore, and it is indeed a bountiful country, a land flowing with milk and honey. Here is the kind of fruit it produces. So get the picture. Like, they go check out the land, and while they're there, they get some fruit and bring it back. And they're like, Moses, yeah, it's a good land. In fact, check out these grapes. Have a bite of this. But then their but got in the way. The very next verse, verse 28, Numbers 13, but the people living there are powerful, and their towns are large and fortified. We even saw giants there, the descendants of Anak. The Amalekites live in the Negev, and the Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites live in the hill country. The Canaanites live along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea and along the Jordan Valley. So what do the spies do? They come back with a report to Moses, and in one hand they're saying, check out the abundance of this land. And in the other hand they're saying, and let me give you an excuse of why we can't have it. It's great, Moses, but it's not for us. That's the message, that's the report from 10 of the 12 spies, but there's 2 more. Because Moses sent 2. The other 2, their names were Joshua and Caleb. Joshua and Caleb don't come back with the same report. Instead, in the next verse, verse 30, but Caleb tried to quiet the people as they stood before Moses. And here's their report. Let's go at once to take the land. We can certainly conquer it. There's a confidence there, a belief there. But the other men who had explored the land with him disagreed. We can't go up against them. They are stronger than we are. Get the picture. You got a standoff going down. You got 10 spies with one report and 2 spies with a whole different report. And this is a standoff. They're disagreeing. One group is saying, we can't do it. And the other is saying, let's go. Yes, we can. Verse 32. So they, in other words, the 10 spies, so they spread this bad report about the land among the Israelites. The land we traveled through and explored will devour anyone who goes to live there. All the people we see were huge. We even saw giants there, the descendants of Anak. Next to them, we felt like grasshoppers. And that's what they thought too. Isn't it interesting how we will project onto other people what they think and believe when we don't even know, because what we think and believe is what we assume they think and believe. I love how Darius Daniels observes this passage. He said the spies' biggest problem wasn't the giants in the land, but the grasshopper in their head. The giants in the land didn't have to do anything to defeat the spies because the grasshopper in their head already did. The people didn't have to do anything because they defeated themselves. They adopted an opinion of themselves that was not consistent with what God said about them. Listen, when God calls you to obey, there will be a grasshopper in your life that has another opinion. And that grasshopper might be a family member, it might be a friend, it might be a coworker, it might be a classmate, it might be culture, it might be your dog that will tell you why this is a bad idea, that will try to convince you that this is the wrong way, that God has not spoken. And we let that opinion silence the voice of God. We let that opinion silence what God has called us to. Listen, when that opinion sounds like a grasshopper, don't let the grasshopper jump from their head to yours. Instead, be reminded of the voice of God. Because the voice of God says, hey, I've sent you, I've equipped you, I'm with you. I've sent you, I've equipped you, I'm with you. That's my opinion. That's what the Lord says. This is my opinion. My opinion is, I'm the one that sent you. My opinion is, I'm not sending you without what you need to do what I've called you to do. I've equipped you. My opinion is, I'm going to be with you. I'm not sending you away and then going to hide. No, I've sent you, I've equipped you, I'm with you. So let's go. But listen, you can be sent by God, you can be equipped by God, and the very presence of God can be with you, but the grasshopper will still speak louder. And when you listen to it, it becomes a barrier to your obedience. Unfortunately, Moses allowed the opinions of the people to be the final answer. And that decision resulted, you know the story, in 40 years in the wilderness. 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. You ever wandered anywhere? You know how pointless it feels? Some of you guys are like, man, I got trapped in the mall once. And I was wandering. And I couldn't get out. I was trapped. Well, the wilderness didn't have air conditioning. 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. And that leads us to the third barrier to obedience. And oh, please hear this one. This powerful truth, this revelation came clear to me recently. And I was like, oh my goodness. The third barrier to obedience is unrestrained fear. Unrestrained fear. If you fast forward Moses' story 40 years, Moses has died. And now God commands his successor, Joshua, one of the spies that went into the land with the good report. God knows who to give succession to. God commands Joshua to now cross the Jordan River and to take the land of Canaan. And so Joshua proceeds to send 2 spies, not 12. He must have thought, yeah, the odds are way too bad if I send 12. He sends 2 spies to scope out the land. These 2 spies go into the land of Canaan, and while they're there, they meet a prostitute by the name of Rahab. And then Rahab shares with these 2 spies some words that I want you to get deep in your heart today. Don't miss this. Don't miss this. This is what Rahab says. I know the Lord has given you this land. We are all afraid of you. Everyone in the land is living in terror. For we have heard how the Lord made a dry path for you through the Red Sea when you left Egypt. And we know what you did to Sihon and Og, the two Amorite kings east of the Jordan River, whose people you completely destroyed. Look what she says. No wonder our hearts have melted in fear. No one has the courage to fight after hearing such things. For the Lord your God, Moses, Joshua, the Lord your God, Joshua, is the supreme God of the heavens above the earth below. Lean in, hear this, hear this. The Israelites were afraid of the people who were afraid of them. The Israelites were scared of the giants in the land, but the giants in the land were scared of them. The giants in the land were scared of the God of Israel. So all of the Israelites are like, oh, this isn't going to go good. We can't take this land. This isn't going to fare well for us. They're scared to death, and yet the whole time, they were scared of them. Now, I don't know how this played out. And let me just remind you, when Rahab says this, it had been 40 years since they had walked through the Red Sea. 40 years since the water had parted and they'd walked through on dry ground. 40 years. So get the picture. For 40 freaking years, they're scared. They're scared. The enemies of Israel had more faith in the God of Israel than the Israelites did. Why? Because the Israelites didn't believe. They didn't believe. And they're the ones that experienced the miracle. The waters part. They go through, millions of them, on dry ground. The armies of Egypt close in. God does the miracle of miracles. They're set free from 400 years of slavery. But God can't give them the promised land. Let me say it again. God sent you. God equipped you. And God is with you. The question is, do you believe it? Do you actually believe that? Or is this unrelenting fear going to rob from you the promised land God has for you? Or are you going to allow your enemy to believe more in what your God can do than you do? I can only imagine what Joshua thought whenever he got word of what Rahab said. I can only imagine these two spies coming back to Joshua and say, Joshua, we met this girl. And she said something that, like, they're living in terror and their hearts are melting with fear because they've heard about what God did for us and how he delivered us on dry ground through the middle of the Red Sea and how the Amorite kings were defeated. And so they're like kind of scared of us. I can imagine Joshua in that moment thinking to him, hearing these words and thinking to himself, are you kidding me? Now, I don't know if Joshua cussed. But I'm guessing that would have been the moment he did, if he did. Because he's probably thinking to himself, we were right. But the people didn't believe. And because of it, we've spent 40 years in a wilderness where millions of our people have died because of our disobedience. Listen, don't give fear the keys to your obedience. Because when you give fear the keys to your obedience, hear me, you simultaneously give fear the keys to your future. The purpose of life is not to arrive safely at death. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. Don't let fear have the final say in your life. Let me wrap up with this. After the Montgomery bus protest, Martin Luther King Jr. received threatening phone calls and letters. And at first he took the threats in stride and didn't pay a whole lot of attention, but they persisted week after week, and he realized that these threats were quite serious, and then fear started to settle into his heart. And after a particularly strenuous day, he was laying in bed one night, and as he was laying in bed, the phone rang. When he picked up the phone, he heard somebody on the other side of the phone, on the other end of the line, speak some racial slurs, and then told him that he would be sorry. He would be sorry that he ever came to Montgomery. That he would be sorry. And King hears these words, and fear begins to settle inside of his heart. And so while he's laying there in bed after he hangs up the phone, he begins to pray. And then he prays out loud. And these are the words he prayed out loud. He said, I am here taking a stand for what I believe is right, but now I am afraid. He's praying this out loud to the Lord. Now I'm afraid. The people are looking to me for leadership, and if I stand before them without strength and courage, they too will falter. I am at the end of my powers. I've come to the point where I can't face it alone. And King said, as soon as he prayed those words, suddenly, he said, I felt a divine presence I've never felt before. He said, and I suddenly heard this inner voice say to me, stand up for righteousness. Stand up for truth. God will be at your side forever. The king said almost immediately the fear passed, and God gave him an inner calm. Later, he said these words. 3 nights later, our home was bombed. Strangely enough, I accepted the word of the bombing calmly. My experience with God had given me new strength and trust. I knew now that God is able to give us the interior resources to face the storms of life. What did King do? He refused to let fear become a barrier to obedience. Listen, we've talked about three things that keep us from obeying God this morning. We've talked about personal excuses. We've talked about people's opinions. And we've talked about unrestrained and unrelenting fear. All 3 of them are the barriers the enemy of your soul wants to use to get you to not obey God, to get you not to follow his plan and his will and his mission for your life. So let me say it one more time. God sent you. God equipped you. and God is with you. And therefore, you can trust him. You can obey him. The question is, do you believe it? Do you believe it? No one can believe it for you. Do you believe it? And if you do, then will you obey? Let's pray.
Thanks so much for listening to this message. If you'd like to learn more about Seven City Church, you can visit sevencitychurch.com. Or if you're in the Fort Worth area, we'd love to invite you to our Sunday service. God bless you and have a great day.